Hello, dear students. In this lecture, we will discuss decision-making process and foreign policy and sub-state actors, which is the fifth chapter of our book, Foreign Policy Analysis. In discussing this subject, we have some objectives to be reached, which are: first, to describe and analyze the major elements of decision-making process in foreign policy, identifying the most important approaches of decisions-making models, and distinguishing between the major sub-state actors of foreign policy, such as bureaucracy, interest groups, pressure groups, and media. Now, we will first discuss the linkage between domestic and foreign policy. Now, the domestic political landscape does have a profound effect in shaping foreign policy, which we already discussed in another chapter of this book, in the first chapter. Now, there are also two competing realms of action that the governments are obliged to prioritize for the purpose of allocation of resources. And governments have to live with the political consequences of their preferences, and their foreign policy choices become a crucial area where a lot of bargaining takes place. And this means that the domestic environment leads to negotiation and bargaining between the government and other domestic actors. Now, there are some domestic actors and non-domestic actors, or internal actors and external actors of foreign policy decision-making. Some of the domestic actors are, of course, the executive branch of the government, the legislative and also judicial branches are actors of domestic politics, influencing the making of foreign policy decision-making. There are also political parties, business coalitions, political action groups, domestic interest groups, pressure groups, the media, and some powerful, influential individuals such as former presidents, and religious groups, and some criminal or terrorist forces as well. When it comes to the external environment, the external or non-domestic actors are, of course, other nation states, some alliances, multinational corporations, which are very influential in current international relations, the international non-governmental and governmental organizations, foreign media, some foreign powerful or influential individuals like former diplomats, presidents, and foreign criminal or terrorist forces are also impacting the foreign policy decision-making process of each state. Now, when it comes to sub-state actors in decision-making process of foreign policy, we can say that by the end of the Cold War, the number of political actors who could shape the way of implementing and shaping a foreign policy decision has increased. It is not only related to the implementing process. Various political actors have also an impact on the shaping, making of foreign policy. And not only nation states, but also sub-state actors can now create a significant impact upon decision-making process by either putting some pressure on elected officials or gathering and deliberating information to decision makers in order to influence them. Consequently, it is clear that there is a link between the role of sub-state actors and decision-making process in foreign policy. Now, one of the main actors domestic actors influencing foreign policy decision-making is the bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy is wide-reaching group of assigned officials in order to execute foreign policy decisions made by decision makers. They are assigned officials. Within the scope of foreign policy, bureaucracy is viewed as a sort of synonym for governments, which means a group of official individuals with different policy preferences. This is an important point. The bureaucratic people working in bureaucracy, the officials, have different policy preferences, and therefore the decision-making process within all governments are a process of negotiating and bargaining and persuading the bureaucratic mechanism to reach a decision. Now, the impacts of bureaucracy upon foreign policy can be understood therefore through the concept of diplomacy and diplomats, because we mentioned that it is a negotiating and bargaining process. Interest groups are another influential domestic actor. Now, an interest group is a group of people who share out a common interest. They have a common interest in their hand, and to satisfy this interest, they try to influence the government or the decision-making mechanism. Now, they can attempt to shape policies by mobilizing the voters or through the way of putting direct pressure on officials. They can put pressure direct on the government officials, or they can influence the voters and mobilize them to put pressure on the government. And they sometimes prefer to gather information for officials when the need arises, but they submit the information which is related to their own interest in their hand. Another domestic actor which we have to mention is the pressure groups. Pressure groups are a group of people who share particular political interests. Then they aspire to increase the level of awareness about some political or social issue, which is one of the interests of the community, by gaining policy support. Pressure groups also aim to influence governments, not take power themselves. This means that pressure groups have a political interest, and they try to increase the level of awareness of this political issue in their hand or as their interest, and therefore they try to influence governments, but they don't aim to take the power in their own hands. They are not aiming to become new rulers. Public opinion is another factor or domestic actor influencing foreign policy decision making. Now, the public opinion in terms of foreign policy is divided into three categories: passive people, which are not mainly interested in foreign policy but can be mobilized by attentive people and opinion leaders. Attentive people are a minority of the population which are interested in foreign policy and have knowledge about foreign policy issues. And opinion leaders are the ones who mobilize the masses in order to pressure or influence the decision-making process. Now, public opinion does not control decision makers, but can put some limitations on them. Another feature of public opinion is to stabilize foreign policy issues because governments are depending on the votes of the mentioned public. And in line with this, public opinion tends to strain pressure on decision makers and can have an impact on them, and they can use the votes as a tool for pressure the governments. And as last, media is another important domestic and a foreign or external factor as well. But we will talk about the internal media. Now, media is primary tool of mass communication. It is used through broadcasting, advertisements, publishing, and the internet, with the aim of reaching and influencing people. It is a sort of communication channel which news, entertainment products, advertisements are delivered to mass public widely and therefore have an important effect. Media can therefore exert pressure on major agents in foreign policy to follow a stance on foreign policy problems which have been disregarded at one point. And at this point, the foreign press, reports and editorial notes in principal newspapers are also able to exert influence on decision makers' ideas and core beliefs on foreign policy issues. Then, as a summary, there are many sub-state actors in the foreign policy decision-making process. This means that it is not only the national state, the government apparatus, who influences into the decision-making process. There are many other domestic sub-state actors which can influence the making of foreign policy of a state, and which are mostly the interest groups, pressure groups, public opinion, media, and most widely the bureaucracy of a state mechanism. Thank you for listening and watching this lecture.